my name's Peter Townley and I'm an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Education. It's my great privilege to welcome you all tonight here, and my particular privilege to introduce to you Professor Dave Putwain's inaugural lecture. Now, Dave, as we all know him, after graduating, his first job was as an A-level psychology teacher at the Sheena Simon College, which is now part of the Manchester College. And during that time, he gained a PGCE in further education. But 5 years after he graduated, he realised that he did not just want to teach psychology, he wanted to do psychology. And in 2006, after completing his PhD, he took up a position at Edge Hill University in the Department of Social and Psychological Sciences. I'm very pleased to say that in 2013 he decided to join the Faculty of Education, where his research examines the way in which psychological factors such as motivation, enjoyment of learning, and perceptions of the classroom environment influence and in turn are influenced by learning and achievement in all stages of education, from primary schooling right through to college and university education. And I think we can see from the large gathering tonight that this is a particularly attractive type of lecture to come to. Now obviously in gaining this knowledge about Dave, I've used several sources. One of them I was slightly surprised to find that I used was from Manchester Metropolitan University, where it said Professor Dave Putwain, and I thought, have I missed something here? But actually I found out that Dave is a graduate of MMU, and he very kindly answered some questions for them on why it would be a good idea to go to MMU. And the very final question that he was asked is, why I love MMU. And would you believe the web page, it's blank. So thanks very much, Dave. We are absolutely delighted that you're here at Edge Hill University and that you're here tonight. And the title of your lecture is, What Does Psychology Have to Offer Education? Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Dave Putwain.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Can everyone hear me okay at the back? Yeah, grand. It's really nice to see so many people here, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you this evening. Okay, so as the title indicates, this lecture, the topic of this lecture, is going to be what psychology has to offer the field of education. So to address this question, I'd like to do two things. First of all, I'm going to argue that psychology, at least in the UK, is underused and perhaps also undervalued in education. And in doing so, we're failing to make use of an array of talent, expertise and potential. There are many ways in which psychology and psychologists can be used to understand and improve education that we're currently not making use of. And second, I'll offer as an example of the ways in which psychology can be used to address educational questions some of the research I've conducted into the ways in which teachers try to motivate students and whether those attempts seem to be working or not. Okay, so the starting point of my talk is this premise. And as Peter alluded in his introduction, I've been moving backwards and forwards between the fields of psychology and education now for 20 years. I did an undergraduate degree in psychology. I then started teaching in 1994. I did a PGCE. I then did a master's degree in applied psychology in the Department of Psychology and a PhD in a Faculty of Education. So this is an opinion which I've formed through moving back and forth from the worlds of psychology and education for the past 20 years or so. Okay, this graph shows HESA data, and it's the number of undergraduate students studying psychology at UK institutions for the past 2 decades. And I think it's fairly evident from looking at this graph that there's been a large increase in the number of people choosing to study psychology, and that there are a lot of people with undergraduate psychology degrees. In fact, the most recent HESA figures are for 2012-13, and they show that psychology is the fourth most popular undergraduate degree subject behind nursing, business studies, and design studies. This graph shows the number of students who were entered for AS and A-level psychology in England, Wales and Northern Ireland institutions over the past 2 decades. You'll notice a big jump around the year 2000, and that was the introduction of Curriculum 2000 and the Deering Report, big jump in the number of AS studies. And in 2014, that was the most recent data, psychology was the fourth most popular subject behind maths, English and biology. So the first conclusion I'd invite you to draw is that there is no shortage of psychological expertise and literacy in this country, and there are no shortage of qualified psychology undergraduates. So why don't these people end up working in education? Or perhaps why don't more of these people end up working in education? Well, I believe there are multifaceted barriers, at least 4 multifaceted barriers to why psychologists and psychology doesn't end up in education more. And the first of these is misconceptions about what psychology is. So psychology is seen by some people, and some of those people are very influential people too, as a soft subject. So for instance, Trinity College, Cambridge lists psychology A-level as what they call a Category B subject. Now, a Category B subject is of limited suitability. So it's not as good as Category A subjects, but it's better than Category C subjects, which should only be taken as a 4th A or AS level option. And these kind of sentiments are echoed in the comments of John Dunford, who in the early 2000s talked about the hidden scandal of A-levels, and he targeted psychology as a particular example of this, not being similar in rigour to traditional A-levels and maths. At the time, he was Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. Now he's the government's National Pupil Premium Champion. So these are influential voices. Now, one of the things psychologists are quite keen to promote is an evidence-based approach to questions like this. So the Curriculum Management and Evaluation Centre at Durham University ranks A-levels in terms of difficulty based on the grades, based on grade input, based on prior attainment, based on a whole host of background factors. And they've actually shown psychology to come out in the middle. True, it is beneath maths and traditional sciences, but it is also ranked as more difficult than history, geography, English and law. And I will leave you to guess which of those subjects makes the Trinity College Cambridge A-list. So where have these ideas about psychology come from? Well, I think some of the blame has to be shouldered by psychology and psychologists themselves. I think in general, we haven't been very good at promoting psychology and explaining to people what psychology is and what psychology has to offer, not just in education, but in all areas of life. And it's my hunch that if the only psychology or psychologist you come across are the types of experts they have on the breakfast news, who really just give you common sense explanation for things, then you're not going to really view psychology as a credible scientific subject. Now, this is something which has been noted and addressed by the British Psychological Society. It now has a public engagement fund, and it seeks to promote psychology much more proactively now than it did in the past. Another barrier is the research foci in psychology. In general, psychology departments in this country are not very interested in educational psychology or educational psychology research. The International Benchmark Review of UK Psychology noted how various types of psychology in the UK were world-leading, but educational psychology research was patchy. Some areas were rated as world-leading, in particular working memory development and understanding of reading development and literacy, but other areas were lagging well behind, and those include motivation and engagement research. And in general, educational psychology and educational psychology research has become detached from the parent discipline. So the reasons for this are lengthy, debatable, and really too long to go into here. But what I would like to say is that there's a general perception that educational psychology is not as scientifically rigorous or theoretically grounded as other areas of psychology. And actually this perception isn't limited to educational psychology, but other areas of applied psychology too. So as a consequence, it's very difficult to attract research funding unless educational psychology research links to another area of psychology such as cognitive development. For instance, the REF 2014, which had 36 units of assessment, psychology is listed with psychiatry and neuroscience. And given that funding is linked to research excellence within a unit, not within a discipline, I think you can see where the bias is going to lie. There are no incentives for departments or schools of psychology to invest in reattaching educational psychology to the parent discipline. I think this perception is wrong, and this perception is short-sighted. For example, many of the statistical tools and models that are beginning to be incorporated in mainstream psychology, such as multi-level modelling, which is simultaneously modelling data from individuals and the groups to which they belong, or simultaneously modelling between and within person change, these ideas have long been used in educational psychology precisely because of the difficulties of modelling real-life data. In education, for instance, it's very obvious that students are located in classes and classes are located in schools, and that the differences between classes and schools are as important as the difference between individual persons. Psychology and initial teacher education, or perhaps the slide could be titled, Whatever Happened to Psychology in Initial Teacher Education? I'm not a child of the 1988 Education Reform Act. In 1988, I was 16 years old, which meant I was in the first cohort of students who went through the GCSE system. And this means that I was educated in a country in which teachers, schools and local authorities or other local consortia use their combined expertise to decide what should be taught until 14, where the programme of study was decided by the O-level/CSE/GCSE examination bodies, as they were called back then. Some of you in the audience might be old enough to, I'm not casting any aspersions here, by the way, might be old enough to remember what teacher training was like before the national curriculum, and I certainly can't because I started teaching in 1994. But I've looked at some of the reviews and critiques of the national curriculum. And one of the things that seems fairly clear is that prior to the introduction of the national curriculum, it was routine for developmental and educational psychology to be taught as part of initial teacher education. And initial teacher education since the national curriculum has become focused on the most efficient and effective way of delivering the national curriculum and meeting qualified teacher status competencies. And so there's very little time in the curriculum for anything else, and developmental and educational psychology has to a large extent become squeezed out. Now, prior to 1988, universities and initial teacher training colleges worked in partnership with local schools and authorities and developed the curriculum themselves. And in this system, educational and developmental psychology were routinely taught as part of initial teacher education. I'm not coming at this from a rose-tinted perspective, by the way, because I'm only a moderate fan of the Smiths, but I recently read Stephen Morrissey's autobiography, and there is a whole chunk of this, probably a good sort of, 50, 60 pages or so, that describe how truly awful his schooling was in the 1970s. And here's just a few kind of choice quotes for you. So I'm not really kind of stuck into this apprehension that in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when there was psychology in initial teacher education, that it made for wonderful teaching. But it does make me wonder, nowadays, in more enlightened times, what would happen if developmental and educational psychology was reintroduced into initial teacher education in a big way? Hazel Francis, who I know that some of you know, Hazel Francis, by the way, was president of the British Educational Research Association. She was on the Executive Council of the British Psychological Society and was one of the founding members of the European Association for Research in Learning and Instruction. When she retired nearly 20 years ago, she wrote this piece in which she was reflecting upon a change which to her was fairly recent. Where's educational and developmental psychology gone in initial teacher education? And she said, well, if it's going to come back, actually, it's got to do three things. First of all, it's got to get away from the idea that psychological theory and knowledge can be generated separately from the educational context it's going to be used in, if it's going to be seen as useful and relevant. And that educational psychology can foster a research-minded approach to questions such as what to teach and how to teach, and it can also use informed ways of understanding the differences between individual pupils, and not just educationally, but these could also be social and developmental and behavioural too. If you have an undergraduate degree in psychology, it's not the easiest thing to train as a teacher. PGCE secondary courses require an undergraduate degree for the subject you're training to teach, and rightly so. Although you can take subject knowledge enhancement courses in some priority areas, including chemistry, computing, maths, and a few other subjects. And it always helps if you've got traditional A-level subjects. De facto, A-level psychology is not quite there. PGCE psychology 14 to 19 with qualified teacher status still just about exists. There's 7 institutions offering places, and they've got about 10 places each, so that's about 70 teachers a year for, as I've pointed out, which is an enormously popular subject. You can train with PGC primary with an undergraduate degree in psychology, but it does differ from one institution to another, and it always helps if you've got traditional A-level subjects. De facto, A-level psychology is not quite good enough. Routes into professional training for educational psychologists, which is a 3-year doctoral programme, are enormously difficult to get on, principally because demand outstrips supply by approximately 1 place for every 40 applicants, and it's only offered at 12 English universities. So what else could psychology and educational psychology do in this country? Well, I look abroad, and I look specifically to Germany and the Netherlands and the United States, where you find whole departments of educational psychology sitting within faculties of education or departments of psychology and alongside, and it's seen as important as, and they do a huge amount of training for an awful lot of roles. Some of it's initial teacher education, some of it is school counselling, which simply doesn't exist in this country, some of it's professional training as a practitioner psychologist, some of it's working with special educational needs, some of it's behaviour support, and so on and so forth. So it seems that other countries have got a much more broad way of including psychology in education than we do in this country. Oops. So anyway, the second conclusion I'd like to invite you to draw is that it's not straightforward for psychological expertise to end up in education. And specifically, there are various systemic and organisational obstacles to psychology graduates working in the educational sector. Okay, so far I've argued that there's a lot of psychological expertise about and not enough of it ends up in education. So the next thing I'd like to consider is why psychology can be usefully applied to education. Estimates of student achievement suggest that about 50% can be attributed to IQ or prior ability. Now, even before getting into an argument or a debate about what IQ or ability actually is and how you measure it, that still leaves about 50% or so of the variability unaccounted for. So what is this made up of? Well, this study here, which is a meta-analysis of just over 7,000 studies, gives you some kind of idea. It identified 42 constructs, which were broadly grouped into motivational constructs, personality constructs, self-regulative constructs, and approaches to learning. The biggest impact on achievement, having accounted for prior ability/IQ, was self-efficacy, followed by effort, followed by having a strongly focused orientation towards grades, low anxiety, and a strategic approach to learning. We can also get some ideas about what contributes to achievement from John Hattie's magnum opus, I think it's fair to describe it as. I'm sure many of you will have read this book. If you haven't come across this book, I mean, I think the scope of it is staggering, actually. So I'll just give you a few statistics. It's a 15-year project of 800 meta-analyses, of 50,000 articles that generated 150,000 effect sizes on about 240 million students. I mean, the scope of it is just mind-boggling. Anyway, he organised, boiled all of these things down into 150 effect sizes, the top 10 of which are here. So, studies like this provide an almost bewildering array of factors and conditions which can enhance or detract from learning and achievement. Some of these things are like conscientiousness, which is considered to be a stable personality trait. Other things are related to the environment, and such as the provision of intervention, and other things are a combination of the environment and the person. So I would argue that psychology is uniquely placed in this respect because these constructs have either originated in mainstream psychology or are interventions which have been designed or implemented or evaluated by psychologists. So the other 50% of variance in achievement that's not explained by cognitive capacity or prior ability is explained by psychological constructs. If you ask your average teacher why a student does well or doesn't do well, the answers that they tend to give you are psychological in nature: motivation, engagement, interest, family background, peer group, and so on. So psychology offers you two things. It offers you a route to understand learning and achievement, and it offers you a route to enhance learning and achievement. So the third conclusion I'd invite you to draw is that psychology is seeking to address the same questions that teachers, school managers, educationalists and policymakers are all interested in and trying to address too. And that is how to facilitate learning, achievement and well-being. And that the answers to these questions in the main require answers about the regulation of behaviour, the regulation of cognition, affect, as well as individual differences, development, and so on. Now, who is it that studies these things? It's psychologists. They might use funny language, it might require demystifying, but where else will you find such a body of knowledge? Okay, that was the warm-up over. I'm going to step off my soapbox for a bit now. It wouldn't be a proper inaugural lecture, I don't think, if I didn't talk about any of my own research, so this is what I'm going to do now. But it's going to carry on in a similar theme and show another way in which psychology can be used to understand and possibly improve education. And it was a bit of an area that I fell into by accident, actually. I didn't set out intending to study this area, but as part of some other research I was doing, this was something that students talked about quite strongly, and so I thought it was worth following up. And really the best way, I think, to introduce this is to listen to students themselves. So I've got a couple of clips from some interviews I did with Year 11 students, and I've also got a quotation which I'd like to show you.
Do teachers ever put pressure on you by, for instance, saying you need to get a C for X, Y, and Z to get into college? If you don't get a C, you're going to find it hard to get a good job, etc.
Yeah, they do. They do that a lot. Like, because I'm not very good at maths, and it was like, Jasmine, your type grades a day. But like, there was a teacher, I don't know who he was. I think it was Mr. Johnson actually. Like, me and him get along. But when I got my grade for my maths, I was like, he read it and he goes, I don't know if you really want to see that. And I was kind of there like, well, I do, because it is my grade at the end of the day. So he showed me and I was like, right, it's an A. I'm only one grade away from my target anyway. And he was like, yeah, but that's not the point, Jasmine. You do need a C to go into college instead of resitting it again and again and again. Like, and because I if I have something to say, I said it, I will say it, I go, what do you mean again and again? And he was like, well, you never know, you might not say it get it again. And I was like, at the end of the day, sir, I will try my best to get it. I'm not going to keep repeating over myself. And he was like, Jasmine, no. But like, the only person who does not pressure me to get my C and tells me you can do it, just keep revising, is Mr. Putwain, my science teacher, because he knows how much I want to get a C in biology. I don't know why, it's just one subject I'd love to get a C in, and he's the only one who turns around to me and says, oh yeah, Jasmine, you can do it, and he don't ever say to me, oh, you do need this C, like, to get to college. He's never spoke to me about C's for college. He wants me to get a C as much as I do, like. And I like that because he just doesn't pressure me with it. He just says it. Oh yeah, Jasmine, if you keep revising with your exercise bit, then he will get your C. And he actually reminds me that I'll get my C. With other teachers, it's you'll get your C and that's it. But like every lesson he's like, you still on target for your C? I'm just like, yeah. But most teachers, they're just like, C, you need a C, you need a C, I'm fed up with the word C. I'm actually fed up with the word C. You need this C, but in college makes it worse as well, because it's putting pressure on the teachers to try and get their students to get a C, for them to get into a college. But the course I'm going on, I only need a D in English. No, yeah, 2 Ds in English, so that's English language and English literature, then I'm in. But I've got a C in English language already, and I'm doing my English literature, but I'm already targeted to D. And then maths, if I don't get my maths here, I can still do it at Stroud College, so it's not like, if you don't get a D in algebra, that's it, you're not having it again. But most teachers, they do the whole, but if you don't get a C, you might not get the good job, because jobs people now are only looking for people with C's, and they're like, why don't you sit my exam for me then? Like, it's so much.
Do you get the feeling that was just waiting to come out?
Okay, and you need to see for college, do you?
Yeah. So I've already got like a Saturday job at the moment in hairdressing, but when I leave school I want to get an apprenticeship, so like you need your grades, and it's also not that as well, it's like if you don't get your C now, they're pressurising me because they're saying you have to do it in college, your English or your maths, so it's like I don't want to do it again, I've done it like 3 times. It's annoying.
So are they talking to you specifically? Is it because they know that, you know, Georgia, she wants to go into hairdressing and she wants to get an apprenticeship, or are they just saying this generally to the whole class?
I think they're generally saying it to everyone.
Yeah.
Especially, they even said it today, my English teacher said if you don't get your C
Yeah.
in May, then you're going to have to do it in college.
Okay.
And I'm just thinking, oh, I don't want to do it in college. Really well.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't really want to hear it. But obviously, it's in a good way, it's good for me to hear it, because that kind of gives me more motivation to revise more and prep for it and stuff like that.
Okay.
So it's kind of a good advantage.
Okay, this is a quote. It was completely unprompted from a student that started me off in this area of research. Okay, so what seems to be going on here is that teachers are telling students why GCSEs are important for their future life trajectory. They need GCSEs to get into college, to help get a good job, and so on. And how are they doing this? Well, they're highlighting the worth of GCSEs and the value of GCSEs. So I refer to these things as value-promoting statements. They're intended to motivate students by highlighting why GCSEs are worthwhile. But as we saw in the clips, and as we saw from the quotation, students' responses and reactions to these messages differ quite widely. Some are seeing them as motivating. Georgia says, you know, she found it helpful. Whereas I think from the quotation that I just showed you, you can see that some people find it pressuring and anxiety-provoking. So how do we make sense of these kinds of messages? Well, I'd go beyond saying there's very little research examining this to there was no research examining this. So in some ways it was a blank page, which can be very helpful, but in other ways it was very difficult to find a starting point. I did find something from what's called the developmental psychopathology literature, which is a bit of a mouthful. Some of you might know Andy Field. He's written a very popular statistics textbook. Well, he also does research looking about how people develop reactions, positive and negative reactions to novel objects. So, for instance, he's done a series of studies where he showed school children novel Australian marsupials. The top one's called a couscous, the middle one's called a quokka, and the bottom one's, I can't remember what the bottom one's called. And he'll give children who've never come across these kind of creatures before information such as they'll make good pets, they're very friendly, or they make bad pets and they bite. And then he measured what happens to their reactions over time. And unsurprisingly, when children are given negative information about these things, they tend to avoid them and develop fear-based responses to them. Another body of work comes from the health communications literature into something called fear appeals. Fear appeals are messages which highlight the negative consequences of a particular course of action. So I'm sure you've all seen the type of messages that you get on cigarette packaging these days. And the one on the left-hand side is from an anti-drink drive campaign in Russia. I don't think they go quite that strong in this country, do they? And, you know, you also see similar things. Some of you might remember the Don't Die by Ignorance campaign that was out in the late 80s and so on. And these kind of messages can be effective when people actually perceive the negative outcome is likely and going to happen to them, if they believe that the alternative course of action is actually going to deliver a positive outcome, and if they feel they're capable of performing these outcomes. And lastly, we've got some competing psychological theory that might be useful here. Self-determination theory is a theory of motivation, and it basically suggests that intrinsic motivation, or IM, leads to hard work and good grades, and the further you move towards extrinsic motivation, the less people work and their grades decline. So because we've got intrinsic and extrinsic motivation being proposed on a single continuum, any kind of teacher practice which promotes autonomy is going to lend towards intrinsic motivation, and any kind of controlling teacher practice is going to lend towards extrinsic motivation. And so from this perspective, really, the critical component of value-promoting messages is their focus on extrinsic values, such as getting into college or getting a good job. In contrast, we've got self-worth theory, and self-worth theory proposes intrinsic and extrinsic motivation on separate continuum. And what damages intrinsic motivation is not necessarily extrinsic factors, but it's fear of failure. So from this perspective, the critical component of value-promoting messages is whether they focus on fear of failure or not. So, based on these various theories, I propose there's 4 dimensions on which we could classify value-promoting messages. Gain-focused messages are those which focus on success and attainment, and loss-frame messages are those which focus on failure or avoiding failure. We can also look at what particular values are emphasised, why are GCSEs seen as important. We can also look at what behaviours are required to attain success or avoid failure, and whether the person feels they're capable of performing them or not, an encouragement to people to perform these behaviours. So some people have asked me in a kind of sceptical tone, well, do teachers really do this? And this study here answers that question. The answer is yes. So this is a survey of about 300 teachers or so. We presented to them different statements and simply asked them whether they agreed or disagreed with these statements. So you can see here, teachers should point out to pupils the worst case scenario of failing their GCSEs to motivate pupils to work hard. Sorry, I've read out the wrong question. Pupils should be reminded that they will fail their GCSEs if they do not complete coursework and revision. You can see most people agree or strongly agree. Pupils should be reminded they will not get into college if they fail their GCSEs. Most people agree. Teachers should point out to pupils the worst case scenario of failing their GCSEs to motivate pupils to work hard. And you can see there's much more of a kind of equal split between agreement and disagreement there. So I think you can say from these kind of studies, most teachers endorse to some degree the use of messages that focus on value and fear of failure. This first slide here shows student-reported frequency of reminders about the consequences of success and failure, such as getting into college, and reminders about the timing of forthcoming exams for a full range of GCSE subjects. And you can see that teachers are using a lot of exam reminders, but not as many consequence reminders. This second slide here, in contrast, reports the same thing, but for maths and English. And you can see that teachers are using consequence reminders much more frequently for these particular subjects. So, no surprise here that value for GCSE for future life trajectory is being emphasised in some subjects more than others. Why might this be? I've got another little clip for you. Why are teachers using these kinds of messages?
Among the kids who have missed the mark, there is one group of girls that have been testing Thornhill's maths department to the limit.
Hannah and Lauren and Sheridan and Beth have been from maths teacher to maths teacher to maths teacher. And we're getting thrown out of lessons.
Oh dear, I've done it wrong.
And they were not making any progress at all.
That's nice and cold.
I did a test with them and they all got U's.
I'm not good at maths. It's just like I read it and no, goes in no. I'm going to be an hairdresser. I'm not going to need to know what x times 2 pi r, whatever it is. I won't need to know that. You don't need to know that in hairdressing. Cannonball! When do you need to find the area of a triangle in life? It's so pointless.
Okay, so one of the first things we did was to create a scale that we could use to measure teachers' use of exam reminders and consequence reminders, and whether they're perceived as threatening or not by students. And you can see here that consequences and exam reminders correlate positively with worry and tension components of test anxiety, and are much stronger when these messages are seen as threatening by students. Of course, this might mean that students who are highly test anxious to begin with are more attentive to these messages and hence report consequence and exam reminders as more frequent and threatening. So in the next study, we measured consequence and exam reminders over 2 waves, which is the end of year 10 and year 11, in a cross-lag model. I haven't included all the paths on this particular diagram, so it can remain partly interpretable, but we did include correlations for all variables at each wave and stability over time. And what we found is that students who perceive these consequence and exam reminders as threatening show higher worry and tension, but not vice versa. So this is lending credibility towards a causal explanation. The next study we did was the first to examine relations with GCSE performance, and we found that consequence reminders are associated with an increase in performance avoidance goals. Performance avoidance goals are where one has a fear of performing worse than one's classmates, and this was negatively related to GCSE grade. We found exam reminders predicted mastery approach, which is a good thing. This is a focus on learning and achievement, and that was positively related to GCSE grade. And we found that perceived threat was related to an increase in test anxiety and a performance avoidance goal, and they all negatively related to GCSE grade. So far we've just been focusing on the use of these messages and their appraisal as being threatening. But these messages are, I think, as the clip showed, interpreted in different ways. Some students find them challenging, some find them threatening, and some just completely ignore them and see them as irrelevant. So we've been following a model that simplistically looks like this in our recent research. in that students make an appraisal based on whether they see the subject as important or not. If the student doesn't see it as the subject as important, then they ignore the message. If they do see the subject as important, then they make competence-based judgments, such as self-efficacy judgments, and they ask the question, am I likely to pass? And if the answer is yes, they're more likely to interpret the message as a challenge, and if the answer is no, they're more likely to interpret it as a threat. So what we did in one of our studies was to create vignettes of different types of students. Some have got high-low self-efficacy, some have got high-low value, and ask A-level students, if this was you, how do you think you would respond? And you can see here that the yellow bar, which is that you're going to disregard the message, is much higher when value is low, and students are much more likely to see these messages as challenging or threatening when value is high. More challenging than threatening when the student expects success, and more threatening than challenging when the student doesn't expect success. And we've also developed a new questionnaire that takes into account challenge appraisals as well as threat appraisals, and you can see that they're both correlated to the value of maths, but maths self-efficacy, that is expectation of success, is positively related to challenge and negatively related to threat. We've also recently started investigating loss versus gain frame statements. So, for instance, we've been presenting Year 10 and Year 11 students with statements such as this. This is a gain frame statement, and it finishes with a positive message. GCSE maths is really important, as most jobs which pay well require GCSE maths, and if you want to go to college you also need to pass in GCSE maths. It's really important to try your hardest, and we compared that with a loss frame statement which starts off exactly the same but has a failure avoidance focus. It finishes, if you fail GCSE maths you'll find it harder to get a good job or go to college. You need to work hard in order to avoid failing. And we found that students who had low value were much more likely to disregard these kind of messages, irrespective whether it had a loss or gain frame. We found that students were more likely to interpret them as challenging when they had high value and high self-efficacy, irrespective of message frame. And we found that students who had high value but low self-efficacy were much more likely to interpret them as threatening, irrespective of message frame. So what kind of findings can we extract from this research that might be of use to teachers and instructors? Well, I think the first point is that communication matters. It contributes to the classroom atmosphere and the motivational climate. The majority of people that I've talked about to this have sort of reflected, those people I've talked about that are teachers, by the way, have reflected upon this, and they've said, gosh, yes, I'm sure I've done that, but I never really thought about it at the time or the impact it might have had. So I think the first take-home message is that what a teacher says to the class does matter and does have impact. The second message, or the second take-home message, is that value-promoting messages, even if well-intended to try and motivate students, might be interpreted in a different way. Does the type of message matter? Well, our research into gain and loss frame messages suggests it doesn't, actually. That the focus, really, the important bit, is the value and importance of the GCSE. What are the impacts on students? Well, it partly depends on student characteristics. I mean, we've touched on this by looking at self-efficacy and value. We've also started looking at something called academic buoyancy, which is whether students think they're good at withstanding pressure, bouncing back from setbacks or not. And I'm also open to the possibility that fear of failure is not always a negative thing, that it might actually be a positive motivator for something. Teacher-student relationship is also going to be important as well. And finally, what's the optimal message? Well, that's the million-dollar question, really, isn't it? We're only really just scratching the surface of this area, and we could make some general recommendations that this type of student responds positively and that type of student doesn't. But really, I'd be quite hesitant about saying something definitive until we've conducted a lot more research on this, and research is currently underway. So, just going back to the overall theme of my lecture then, what does psychology have to offer education? Well, 4 things struck me when I was writing this lecture. And I think, first of all, it offers a robust evidence base for practitioners. Secondly, it offers insights into why students achieve and progress more than others, above and beyond ability and prior attainment. It also offers insights into the impact of the learning environment on progress and achievement, and how pupils can shape that environment. And lastly, it offers insights for things that all teachers and educators want to know about: student motivation, student engagement, student learning, student progress, and student achievement. And really, what more could you ask for? So, just before I conclude my lecture, as I was writing this, I was reflecting on, 20 years actually since I graduated, and it became very clear to me, and I thought about a lot of the people that have helped me along the way. And I thought, I really want to say thank you to these people, and I started making a mental list of everyone I wanted to say thank you to. And then I realised I was going to end up like, one of those people at an awards show when they get given a golden something, and 5 minutes later they're reading off this great big list, and it just looks ridiculous. So I decided I wouldn't. But I couldn't have done this without my family. Thank you very much. I couldn't have done this without all of the wonderful people I have worked with, both past and present, and all the people who have given me opportunities along the way. So to those people, thank you very much.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much. It gives me great pleasure to be able to offer a vote of thanks to Professor Dave Putwain for his talk this evening, which was extremely enlightening. I've worked closely with Dave, I think I can say that, for about 4 years on and off. I've been very familiar with his work on exam anxiety. I've always been aware of its importance nationally, but also, as Dave pointed out in his talk this evening, its importance both in a European context and moving forward in terms of UK educational reform. I think it's very, very important, obviously, it's very important for us to have Dave as part of our team in the Faculty of Education, but I think it's also extraordinarily important that this type of work is being undertaken. And without wanting to diminish anything that Dave has said this evening, those excerpts, I think those extracts are actually listening to what the pupils have to say about their own anxieties, their own anxieties around examinations is really, really powerful, extremely powerful. And thanks, Dave, for giving us a glimpse into that. One of the things that I'd want to say is that Dave started with the question, what has psychology to offer education? I don't think any of us are in any doubt about the value of psychology, the importance of actually reintroducing developmental and educational psychology into the curriculum. So the upshot, I think, of anything that I want to say as a vote of thanks is, thank you very much. You've given us an awful lot to think about tonight, but we ought to start campaigning here and now to make sure that psychology has its appropriate place in the curriculum going forward. Thank you, Professor Dave Putwain, for such an entertaining
Thank you.
I've got a few just in front here.
Can I ask a question? This might sound more critical of the system than of anything else, but I can see an underlining sense of the importance of the C, and this kind of makes me worry that the pressure on teachers is focused more on getting lower level students who are struggling up to a C than it is on getting sort of your middle of the road students on their Bs up to an A or an A star, which they may have the potential to achieve. Is this not a sort of issue in the psychology of a teacher? How do we sort of get around that?
Is this something that you've got first-hand experience of?
Well, I can't help it. I've had experience of being sort of a middle-of-the-road student who's been sort of on the Bs, on the As, and other students who've had similar experience. And the focus does, I hate to sound sort of vaguely right-wing, and I really don't want to sound like that at all, for the record. But I do think there is more of a focus on getting students up to a C. And because, unfortunately, that is the grade, that is what you need to get into college, into any employment you see in English and Maths is vital. But that takes away a little bit, I think, from students who have the potential to maybe do better than they're currently doing, who are, to that teacher, already up to the level that is all right and they don't need worrying about.
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, it's my experience of working with schools and colleges that CD borderline gets an awful lot of attention in schools. I mean, I think my colleagues who actually work more closely with schools will probably provide a more informed answer than I could. But my hunch is it doesn't detract from students that are in higher bands / grades and or teachers' attempts to want to drive and push those students. But again, I think people who work more closely with the actual day-to-day work of teachers than I do will probably give you a more informed answer than I could.
I work in a high-achieving girls' grammar school, and it really doesn't make any difference. They have anxiety at every level. You're being pushed to get the A's to the A stars, the B's to the A's. It's exactly the same, the pressure all the way through.
It's not, I'm actually thinking more so now, not so much the pressure on the students, but the pressure on the teacher. The pressure on the teacher to get the C is so much more important.
But we have pressure to get the B's, we have pressure to get the A's.
Okay,
the target's all the way through. There's the pressure at every single level. It's looking at the individual student that is often sometimes a difficulty.
And indeed, you can extrapolate that to on initial teacher education for applicants, and we have final year undergraduates going through a similar exercise in terms of getting necessary skills tests in those classic subjects of numeracy and literacy.
Yes, that's right. It's not just limited to GCSE, is it? In relation to the point you just made, one of my colleagues in the States has looked at the pressure teachers perceive on themselves, either in relation to performance-related pay or I think they've got much more harsh systems in terms of accountability and removing teachers from posts. They're not tenured quite as strongly as they are in the UK. So he's been looking at the relationship between teacher pressure and the use of these kinds of threatening statements, and he's found quite a strong relationship. So the more pressure teachers are under, the more they use these kind of pressured statements with pupils. So it seems there's a pressure coming from above, and that is critical of the system.
Yeah, very interesting, David. It's, and this is going to be an odd question for a psychologist to answer, I'm afraid. But in terms of the take-home message, in terms of what psychology brings to bear on this, you talked about evidence-based, it highlights individual differences between students. And yet what struck me was the examples you talked about were very communicationally based. This is the environment. This is how pupils and teachers talk to each other. Now, if I was a linguist or a sociolinguist or a discourse analyst or a sociologist, I'd be a little bit upset because I would think, well, framing and concepts like that and studying individual reactions to these things can be approached from other disciplines as well, and they're evidence-based. And so I suppose what I'm interested in is what's unique about psychology. Is it the ascribing of mental states to people in terms of the way that you did it in terms of self-efficacy or fear of failure? Is that what's unique about psychology? And is psychology uniquely positioned to do that? And it was interesting when you talked at the start about the ref and neuroscience and psychiatry, because of course the whole point about psychology, and this is why I'm warning you, it's an odd question for a psychologist, it's a terribly broad subject, broader than many of those other subjects. If you're a linguist interested in framing, it's quite specific. So do you think psychology is as well positioned as it could be to answer these questions which you pose, which are very important questions, but is psychology the best discipline to answer?
I think there's about 3 or 4 questions in there. I think taking the last one, which is the one I can remember. I think the way psychology goes about answering these questions, perhaps because it, due to its emphasis on individual measurement and individual conceptualization of states, makes it amenable to understanding individual differences between pupils. And teachers are concerned with individual differences between pupils as well as group differences. And it's often about understanding an individual and how an individual progresses and the achievement of an individual, within the greater context. And I think, rightly or wrongly, because psychology tends to focus on things in that way, it gives it utility. It gives it utility to teach, a very practical utility. It gives it a usableness that I think doesn't come, for instance, from sociolinguistics or discourse analysis, which by nature, and I'm not diminishing those, but they tend to be focused on what I'd call the bigger questions, and perhaps more important questions about structure, agency, how that fits into a particular system, and if you wanted to get critical of a particular system. So it's not to diminish those things because they're not important, but I think if you're a person in a class and somebody's saying, should I be using these messages or shouldn't I be using these messages, you need some fairly kind of concrete answers about why somebody might be responding positively or not. So I think that's that's the uniqueness psychology has got to offer for this particular strand of research. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
No, this is the last one, yeah.
Okay.
I have a question about this behind the question, because when you use the term psychology, I think we need to say what kind of psychology. It relates to the gentleman's question there. Give you an example. I'm an educational psychologist, and I was in a school recently, and the first bit of psychology I used was this assessment of individual differences. So this young 15-year-old assessed on reading and spelling skills was at the 2nd percentile. So reading age equivalent, spelling age equivalent of about 7 or 8-year-old. And his head was going down as I was asking these questions. So this kind of psychology that looks at deficits and individual differences was one aspect. And then I asked the question, when are you in your element? What's your passion? And he told me about free running in Liverpool. You know what free running in Liverpool is? Running on buildings where the busies are after you. But he came alive. His language was brilliant. He said, I can visualize my route out of here using language that just didn't fit with this boy at the 2nd percentile. And that, to me, is a different kind of psychology, which is about growth mindset. It's about positive psychology, and so I don't think you can use the term, we can use the term as what has psychology got to offer, as what kind of psychology. Now, how you go with that curriculum of free running, I don't know, but I could imagine he'd be a brilliant climber, he'd be a great outdoors teacher, because he's got the personality to do it and all those other things. And I just really, it's not a question, it's a statement about it's what kind of psychology are we using to take our research forward. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Thank you. Well, I suppose as an applied psychologist and somebody who's a kind of pragmatist by heart, I'm quite happy to pick and choose. I don't mind what kind of psychology it is. If it's useful and it works, that'll do for me.
I'm a head teacher of a cross-phase emotional behavioural difficulty special school. We're finding increasingly our pupils are becoming more and more challenging, and I think due to things like social factors, medical factors such as babies living when they would have died years ago, due to the technological advances in medicine and so on. As educators, we are not just focusing on teaching as such, but in terms of our support for the child and the whole family. In my work, where I'm trying to re-educate our staff with a massive focus on the psychology, including, like we've mentioned, the positive psychology, and enjoying being in a school before anything else to actually get that motivation. But you mentioned before about the initial teacher training and maybe bringing back it into there, and I feel for the majority of not just special schools, I've worked in special mainstream and girls' grammar school and so on, that the teachers in all our schools need this now, and I think by the time it comes through in the initial teacher training, it's going to take years to actually get that into our system. How can we actually get that faster into our system to encourage that change quicker for the pupils that need it now rather than in years to come?
I really wish I'd left that slide in which I took out about QTS competencies and what is generally called in psychology relational support, because there's a whole branch of psychology about the psychology of learning and instruction that addresses those issues, and it just doesn't map onto any QTS competency, so it's simply not there. It requires a change at the top, and they're the hardest ones to affect, aren't they? because it requires those at the top to see the value of it and therefore put a load of money into providing sufficient CPD for it to happen. But that's not to say that it can't work at a grassroots level, because it's not an EBD school, but I've worked quite closely in the past 12 months with an alternative school, which are prioritising all of those areas which you've just mentioned. And it hadn't come from any particular research or any particular psychological input. It was the vision of the head teacher that thought this is the way to go for these particular pupils. And all of the staff were trying to grapple with this, and it was working, actually. For want of a better word, they were working with kids who hated school. And, they took this into account and didn't try to force them, down a kind of sausage factory model of education. And the children responded. And, principally they responded to people giving them respect and not speaking down to them, treating them like adults to some degree. But what was interesting to me was that they'd come to a conclusion about what was the best way to educate these children, using a kind of mixture of common sense and experience. Whereas this could be something which is addressed right from the very outset of initial teacher education. But I think, how do you affect a big-scale change? Well, a big-scale change needs support from the top. Otherwise, it's just going to rely on grassroots practitioners like yourself saying, no, this is the way we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Colleagues, friends, there are refreshments outside. I would just like to once again thank Dave for a valuable and important talk and for answering our questions. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much.